The night sky was alive with strange colors. Ethan's small ship had burned through the atmosphere of an unknown planet. The crash had been violent, metal tearing apart as fire licked the wings. By some miracle, Ethan had survived, stumbling out of the broken wreck, coughing smoke. Around him stretched a forest unlike anything on Earth. The trees were tall as towers, glowing with faint blue light. The air smelled of iron and flowers, heavy and strange. Every step he took sank into soil that pulsed faintly, like it was alive. Fear gripped his chest as he realized he was far from home, far from safety. He searched the wreckage for supplies, his hands shaking. A small pack of food, a broken comm device, a flare gun with only one shot. That was all he had. His heart sank, but survival was the only choice. Then came the sound that froze his blood. A deep vibration in the ground, like the footsteps of something enormous. He turned slowly, eyes wide. From between the glowing trees, two figures emerged. At first he thought they were statues, but then they moved. Two alien giantesses, their bodies towering like mountains. Their skin shimmered with faint silver tones under the moonlight. One had long hair flowing like black rivers, her eyes sharp as blades. The other's hair glowed faint green, her gaze softer but filled with curiosity. Ethan stumbled backward, his hands raised in panic. The giantesses spoke in a language of echoes, their voices deep and melodic. The fierce one's tone was hard, sharp, filled with command. The gentler one replied softly, almost questioning, but their eyes were locked on Ethan, as if he were prey. He turned and ran, his legs pumping through the alien forest. Branches tore at his clothes, roots caught his boots. But behind him came thunderous footsteps, the ground shaking with every step they took. A shadow fell across him, and before he could scream, something wrapped around his body. Glowing vines had sprung from the earth at the command of the giantesses. They coiled around him like living ropes, lifting him from the ground. Ethan cried out, struggling, his body twisting as he tried to break free. But the vines were alive, pulsing, tightening with every move. He dangled in the air, caught like a small insect. The fierce giantess stepped closer, her eyes narrowed, her lips curling in something between hunger and amusement. She lifted her massive hand, her finger nearly the size of his chest, and traced the air near him. Ethan shivered, his mind screaming that this was the end. The gentler giantess placed a hand on her sister's arm, stopping her. She shook her head, her eyes studying Ethan with a strange curiosity. The fierce one growled, her voice rolling like thunder, but she did not strike. Instead, she turned her hand and summoned the vines tighter, creating a glowing cage around him. Ethan was lowered into the forest floor, trapped inside a dome of living light. The vines bent and twisted, forming walls that pulsed with energy. He pressed his hands against them, but every touch sent a shock through his skin. He fell back, breathing hard, his heart hammering. The giantesses crouched down, their massive eyes peering into the cage. He felt smaller than ever, like a mouse in the hands of towering gods. The fierce one leaned close, her breath rushing like a storm. Her eyes glinted with something primal, something that made Ethan's stomach twist with fear. But the other spoke again, softly, her hand resting on the glowing bars of the cage. Her tone was not cruel, but questioning. Ethan realized with a jolt, they were not mindless beasts. They were thinking, speaking, deciding. He pressed his hands to his chest, pointing to himself. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice shaking. The giantesses blinked, tilting their heads. The gentler one repeated the sound. "Ethan," her voice echoing like a distant song. The fierce one scoffed, but her gaze flickered, as if curious despite herself. Night deepened around them, and strange calls echoed through the alien woods. The giantesses did not leave him. They stood like guards beside his cage. Ethan sat in the corner, his mind racing. He was alive, but for how long he did not know. The thought clawed at him. Were they keeping him as food, a trophy, or something far worse? Fear wrapped around him tighter than the vines. But deep inside, another thought whispered. If they wanted him dead, they could have crushed him already. Fate, it seemed, had other plans. The cage of glowing vines pulsed softly in the night. Ethan sat with his back pressed against the strange wall, his breath uneven, his hands trembling. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the towering shadows of the giantesses above him, their huge eyes watching him as though he were a fragile animal. The fear in his chest did not fade. It grew stronger with every heartbeat. The fierce one, the dark-haired giantess, stood with her arms crossed, her gaze sharp as knives. She paced slowly around the cage, her heavy steps shaking the ground, each one reminding Ethan how small and powerless he was. Her voice rumbled now and then, words he could not understand, but the tone was clear: disapproval, warning, threat. The gentler one, the green-haired giantess, stayed closer to the cage, kneeling so that her glowing eyes were level with Ethan. Her voice was softer, melodic, like wind moving through leaves. She spoke to him as if she expected him to answer, her expression curious, almost kind. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. He pointed to himself again, whispering, "Ethan," his voice shaking but steady enough to echo inside the cage. The gentler giantess repeated it, testing the sound with her alien tongue. "Fun." The fierce one muttered something sharp, her glare burning like fire. But Ethan noticed the faintest flicker of conflict in her eyes, like even she could not fully decide what he was. Hours passed slowly, the alien night stretching into silence, broken only by distant roars of unseen beasts. Ethan's stomach growled, reminding him of his hunger. The sound echoed embarrassingly loud inside the cage. The gentle giantess tilted her head, watching him carefully, then stood and reached into the forest. When she returned, she carried glowing fruit the size of his torso, its skin shimmering like liquid glass. With a careful hand, she tore it open, letting the sweet scent spill into the air. She placed a small piece through the vines, the glowing bars opening just wide enough to let it pass. Ethan hesitated, his instincts warning him it could be poison. But the giantess waited patiently, her glowing eyes steady on him. The fierce one scoffed loudly, folding her arms as if mocking both of them. Ethan's hunger, however, clawed deeper, and at last he took the piece. He bit into it cautiously, the taste flooding his mouth with strange sweetness and warmth. To his surprise, it did not harm him. Instead, it filled his empty stomach and gave him strength. The gentle one smiled faintly, a gesture so human-like it made Ethan's chest ache with confusion. As the night went on, Ethan began to notice more. The fierce one was not cruel without reason. She kept glancing at the shadows beyond the trees, as if protecting her sister. Her sharp words were not just for him. They were warnings of danger in the forest. The gentle one, though curious about Ethan, never fully lowered her guard either. It struck Ethan then. They were not hunters enjoying a captured prey. They were survivors too, stranded in this hostile world. At one point, the ground shook with a roar in the distance. The fierce giantess immediately stepped closer to the cage, her massive hand resting on the glowing bars as her eyes scanned the forest. The gentle one moved behind her, speaking quickly in their strange tongue. Ethan felt a surge of fear, thinking they were preparing to kill him at last. But then he realized they were not looking at him, they were protecting him. He pressed his hand against the vine bars, whispering again, "Ethan," pointing to himself with urgency. Then, gathering his courage, he pointed at them, waiting. The gentle one tilted her head, then touched her chest. "Lyra," she said slowly, her voice carrying strange beauty. The fierce one frowned, reluctant, but after a long pause, she growled her name, "Ceres." Ethan repeated them softly, "Lyra, Ceres." The names felt heavy in the air, like a fragile bridge built between them. For the first time, Ceres did not look at him like prey, but like a puzzle. Her eyes narrowed, not in hatred, but in thought. Lyra, meanwhile, gave a small nod, almost approving. The bond was thin, delicate as glass, but it was there. Ethan realized with a jolt. He was no longer just their prisoner. He was becoming something else to them. Not yet a friend, not yet an ally, but no longer only prey. As the alien moonlight bathed the cage, Ethan leaned back against the vines, exhausted but strangely hopeful. He did not know what fate had in store, but in the eyes of the two giantesses, he saw something more than death. He saw the beginning of a bond that could change everything. The alien dawn rose slowly, painting the sky with colors Ethan had never seen before. Shades of violet and green shimmered across the horizon, casting strange light through the towering forest. Ethan sat inside the glowing vine cage, his body stiff, his mind restless. All night he had replayed the names in his head. Lyra, the gentle one, Ceres, the fierce one. He whispered them like prayers, hoping the fragile bond he had started to build would save his life. But Ceres was not convinced. At sunrise, she approached the cage with sharp eyes, her long hair swaying like a dark banner. She spoke in her thunderous voice, her words cold and sharp. Ethan did not understand, but her meaning was clear. She wanted proof. To her, he was still prey, a fragile creature unworthy of trust. Lyra placed a hand on Ceres's arm, her voice calm, soothing. She spoke in her melodic tone, perhaps urging patience. But Ceres only shook her head, her gaze hardening on Ethan. Then, with a sweep of her hand, the glowing vines around him loosened and fell away. Ethan stumbled forward, free at last, but not safe. The sisters had released him not out of kindness, but for a test. Ceres pointed toward a small clearing in the forest, her eyes cold. The ground there glowed faintly, a circle marked by vines and broken stones. Ethan's stomach twisted as he realized what it meant. A trial. They wanted to see if he could survive without their mercy. The moment he stepped into the circle, the vines sealed the perimeter, rising high like a living wall. Ethan was trapped again, but this time in a larger space. Lyra crouched nearby, her gaze steady, almost apologetic. Ceres folded her arms, watching with the intensity of a hunter. The forest around the circle grew silent, too silent. Then a low growl echoed through the air. From the shadows of the trees, a beast emerged, its body covered in shimmering scales, its eyes burning with red fire. It was larger than any animal Ethan had ever seen, its claws long enough to tear through stone. His heart pounded, his throat dry. This was no test of words. This was survival. Ethan looked down at his meager supplies. A broken knife salvaged from the wreck, a piece of metal pipe, and his will to live. Fear threatened to choke him, but deep inside, another voice whispered this was his chance. If he failed, Ceres would never see him as more than prey. If he succeeded, perhaps she would see him as something more. The beast lunged, its roar shaking the ground. Ethan rolled to the side, grabbing a sharp stone from the dirt. He remembered his training, the instincts of survival drilled into him long ago. He used the environment, moving toward the broken stones, forcing the beast to stumble. With quick hands, he lashed the stone to the pipe with torn cloth from his shirt, creating a makeshift spear. Lyra's eyes widened slightly, her lips parting in surprise. Ceres leaned forward, her gaze unblinking. Ethan gripped the weapon tightly, his breath sharp. The beast roared again, swiping its massive claws, tearing vines and soil apart. Ethan ducked under the strike, using his small size as an advantage. He drove the spear forward, striking the beast's leg. It howled, thrashing in rage. The weapon snapped in half, but Ethan rolled away, grabbing another stone, his body fueled by desperation. The fight raged on, the ground shaking with every movement. Ethan's body screamed in pain, cuts across his arms, sweat blinding his eyes. But he did not stop. With each move, he adapted, turning weakness into strategy. Finally, As the beast lunged again, Ethan sidestepped and drove the broken spear into its throat. The creature let out a final roar before collapsing, its body trembling before falling still. Silence fell across the clearing. Ethan stood over the fallen beast, his chest heaving, blood on his hands, but fire in his eyes. He had survived, not because of strength, but because of his human will, his cunning, his refusal to give in. Lyra's face softened, pride flickering across her features. Ceres, however, stood frozen, her eyes wide with something Ethan had not seen before: respect. For the first time, the fierce giantess looked at him not as prey, not as a fragile insect, but as a warrior. She said something low, almost reluctant, her tone less sharp than before. Ethan did not understand the words, but he understood the shift. The test had changed him in their eyes. As the vines of the circle lowered and the sisters stepped closer, Ethan staggered but stood tall. He met their gaze, his voice hoarse but firm. "Human," he said, pointing to himself, his eyes burning with determination. Lyra nodded slowly, her lips curving into the faintest smile. Ceres remained silent, but the fire in her eyes told him everything. He had proven himself. He was no longer only a captive. He was something far more dangerous. He was a survivor. The forest was silent after the trial. The body of the fallen beast still smoked faintly, its scales cracked and its glowing eyes now dim. Ethan stood over it, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion, his hands trembling, but his spirit unbroken. Ceres and Lyra watched from the edge of the circle, their giant forms still as statues, their gazes locked on the small human who had just defied death. Ceres finally stepped forward, her heavy boots crushing the soil. Her sharp eyes studied Ethan with something new, something that looked strangely close to respect. She muttered a few words in her thunderous voice, her tone no longer filled with mockery, but with reluctant acknowledgement. Lyra, however, leaned closer, her glowing eyes filled with warmth, her melodic voice carrying his name again. "Lun." For a moment, Ethan almost believed he had taken the first steps toward freedom. But fate was not finished with him. The forest shook again, this time more violently than before. The ground cracked, trees bent, and an ear-splitting roar tore through the sky. From the shadows emerged another beast. Larger, more terrifying, its skin armored with jagged plates of stone, its mouth dripping with burning liquid that hissed as it touched the soil. It was no trial, no controlled test. This was something neither Ethan nor the sisters had planned. Ceres cursed in her alien tongue, pulling Lyra back with a protective arm. The monster roared, its eyes wild with hunger, charging straight toward them. Ethan froze, fear clutching his chest again, his broken spear still clutched in his bleeding hand. He looked at the giantesses. Surely they could crush the beast with their size and power. But Ceres's movements were slower than before, as though even she was cautious of this predator. The sisters stepped back, their hesitation clear. Ethan's mind raced. If the beast reached them, it would not stop. It would tear everything apart. Even the towering giantesses seemed vulnerable before its fiery strength. And for a brief moment, he realized something terrifying. They needed him. Not for strength, not for size, but for the one advantage he carried: human cunning. The beast lunged, fire spilling from its jaws. Lyra cried out, shielding her face with her arm as flames licked the ground. Ceres swung her massive arm, striking the creature's side, but the armored plates absorbed the blow, sending her staggering back. Ethan's heart pounded as he looked at the broken stones and the fallen vines from his earlier trial. An idea sparked, dangerous but desperate. He sprinted across the circle, grabbing the flare gun from his belt, the one tool he had saved since the crash. His hands shook, sweat dripping into his eyes. He shouted, his small voice drowned out by the beast's roar, but the sisters saw him. Lyra's eyes widened in horror, as if she knew what he intended. Ceres snarled, perhaps yelling at him to stop. But Ethan didn't stop running. He leapt onto a broken boulder, aiming the flare gun at the monster's open mouth. For a split second, time slowed, the beast's molten breath glowing like the sun, its red eyes burning into him. Ethan pulled the trigger. The flare shot out, a streak of blinding fire, vanishing into the monster's throat. The explosion tore through its body from the inside, fire bursting out of its eyes and jaws. The beast let out a scream that shook the sky before collapsing into the earth, flames consuming its armored shell. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of burning vines. Ethan fell to his knees, his chest heaving, his body barely holding together. He had used his last weapon, his final chance, and somehow he had survived again. But this time, he had done more than survive. He had saved them. Lyra was the first to move, kneeling beside the smoldering corpse, her glowing eyes filled with shock and awe. She turned to Ethan, her voice soft but filled with something new, gratitude. "Ethan," she whispered, as if the name carried more weight now than ever. Saris approached slowly, her sharp gaze locked on the small human. She said nothing for a long time, her shadow towering over him, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she lowered her head in a nod. It was not warm, not gentle, but it was respect. The fierce giantess had acknowledged him. Ethan's hands shook as he sat back against the broken stone, his breath shallow. He had faced 2 trials in one day, and somehow fate had carried him through both. As the smoke rose into the alien sky, one thought burned in his mind. He was no longer just a prisoner, no longer just a test subject. He had become something more to them. Not prey, not toy, not weakness, but an ally, maybe even a protector. And deep inside, though his body trembled with exhaustion, a spark of hope lit within him. Fate, once again, had other plans. The flames from the fallen beast smoldered through the night. Ash drifted into the air, glowing faintly against the alien sky. Ethan sat on the ground, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion, his mind torn between fear and wonder. He had survived, not once but twice. And now, the eyes of the 2 giantesses no longer looked at him as prey. There was something else, something unspoken. Lyra crouched beside him, her enormous hand hovering close, but not touching. Her eyes glowed softly, her voice melodic as she spoke his name. "Hun." He could not understand her words, but the tone was different now. Gentle, grateful, even protective. Sarah stood behind her, arms crossed, her expression as sharp as ever, but her silence carried a strange weight. She had seen his courage, his cunning, his refusal to surrender. And though her pride resisted, she could no longer deny his worth. For a while, they remained in silence, the forest settling after chaos. Then Lyra lifted her gaze to the sky, speaking in slow, deliberate tones. Ethan followed her eyes and saw shapes faintly glowing among the stars, massive structures drifting in orbit. He frowned, his heart tightening. Were those ships or something else? Lyra pressed her hand to her chest, then motioned outward toward the heavens. Her voice softened, carrying a sadness Ethan could feel even without knowing her language. Saris muttered something sharp, shaking her head, but Lyra continued. She tore a piece of glowing bark from a tree and used her sharp nail to etch symbols into the dirt. Ethan leaned forward, trying to make sense of it. First, she drew towering figures, giantesses, their forms strong and proud. Then she drew a smaller figure, clearly meant to be him, a human. She placed the human symbol beside the giants, but then slashed through it with a sharp motion. Her eyes lowered, her tone filled with sorrow. Ethan's mind raced. What did it mean? Lyra added more. Symbols of stars, a great circle, and lines crossing through it. Saris knelt now, her eyes burning as she added her own harsh marks into the soil. Her tone was sharp, filled with anger, as she drew other giant figures, larger, stronger, surrounding 2 smaller ones. Ethan's eyes widened. He understood. Lyra and Ceres were not free, they were exiles, banished from their people, forced to survive on this hostile world. And to their kind, humans were not friends, not equals. They were prey, hunted, maybe even trophies. The truth sank into Ethan's chest like a stone. He was alive not because of mercy, but because fate had tied him to two outcasts. They were different from the others of their kind, different enough to spare him, different enough to see something else in him. Lyra's voice grew softer as she traced the human symbol again, this time placing it beside hers without crossing it out. She looked at Ethan with a fragile hope in her eyes. Ceres growled, shaking her head, but even she did not destroy the symbol this time. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He pointed at himself, whispering, "Human," then pointed at them, repeating softly, "Lyra, Ceres." Lyra smiled faintly, a rare and fragile thing. Ceres scowled, but her eyes betrayed conflict. She was not ready to trust, but she no longer wished to kill him. And that, Ethan realized, was a beginning. The night deepened, and the three of them remained close to the smoldering remains of the beast. Ethan felt both fear and comfort in their presence. He was trapped still, far from home, surrounded by dangers he barely understood. But he now knew the truth. The sisters carried a secret, a wound that tied their fate to his. And somewhere beyond the stars, others of their kind waited. If they ever found him, his bond with Lyra and Ceres might mean nothing. To them, he would be nothing more than prey. But here, on this world, under this strange sky, things were different. Here, Ethan was no longer just a human prisoner. He was a piece of something larger, a part of a bond born from exile, survival, and defiance. And though danger pressed closer with every passing night, he felt something stir inside him, the beginning of trust, the start of something that could either save them all or doom them together. The forest was restless that night. Strange cries echoed in the distance, low and haunting, as if the world itself was warning of dangers yet to come. Ethan sat close to the glowing embers of the fallen beast, his body sore, his mind heavy with the truth he had learned. Lyra and Ceres were not ordinary wanderers. They were outcasts, exiles forced to survive on this wild planet. Their people, far above the skies, saw humans as prey, nothing more. And yet, despite that cruel belief, these two had spared him, even fought beside him. As the silence stretched, Ceres stood tall, her sharp eyes scanning the trees. Her posture was tense, her muscles coiled like a warrior who trusted nothing. Lyra knelt beside Ethan, her glowing hair spilling like light around her face. She reached into her satchel, pulling out a fragment of crystal fruit, and offered it to him with care. Ethan hesitated, then took it, his hunger stronger than his fear. The sweetness spread through his body, filling him with warmth. When his eyes lifted, he found Lyra watching him, her gaze soft but steady. Ceres muttered something sharp, shaking her head, but Lyra answered calmly. Their words clashed like two sides of the same storm. Ethan could not understand the language, but he knew the meaning. Lyra saw him as more than prey. Ceres still fought against that idea. And yet, Ceres' silence after their argument spoke louder than her words. She was beginning to bend, even if she hated it. The next day brought new trials. The sisters moved through the forest with Ethan following in their shadow. They hunted glowing beasts, their movements graceful and deadly, their sighs making the earth tremble. Ethan watched, learning from them, but also finding ways to help. He gathered small herbs, sharp stones, and pieces of metal from the wreck of his ship. Using his hands, he crafted traps, snares, and small defenses. At first, Ceres scoffed, laughing at his tiny tools. But when one of his snares brought down a swift creature that had evaded even her reach, she paused, her eyes narrowing with new respect. That evening, they built a camp together. Lyra shaped glowing vines into a protective wall, while Ceres cut down massive branches for shelter. Ethan worked beside them, weaving smaller barriers to fill the gaps. For the first time, They were not captor and captive, but companions in survival. The air between them felt different, lighter, though the shadows of mistrust still lingered. Later, as they sat around the fire, Lyra pointed at Ethan and then at the stars, speaking slowly. She repeated a word again and again, her hand pressing to her chest. Ethan listened carefully, then mimicked the sound, awkward but earnest. Lyra's face lit with quiet joy. Saris rolled her eyes, but her lips twitched as if hiding a smirk. Through patience and repetition, they began to trade simple words, fragments of language slowly stitching their worlds together. Days passed, and the bond grew stronger. When wild beasts attacked, Ethan's quick thinking saved them, using fire and clever traps. When hunger struck, the sisters shared food with him, even the best parts of their hunt. When storms raged, they shielded him beneath their massive hands, their warmth protecting him from the cold winds. Each act chipped away at the walls of fear, replacing them with something new. Trust, fragile but real. One night, danger came closer than ever. A pack of shadow creatures swarmed from the trees, their bodies thin but swift, their eyes glowing like embers. Ethan shouted in warning as the beasts leapt at the camp. Lyra struck first, her hand sweeping like a storm, crushing several at once. Saris fought with ferocity, her movements precise and merciless. But it was Ethan's fire, his small torch lit with resin and sparks, that drove the rest away. The creatures hissed, retreating into the forest's darkness, leaving silence behind. When it was over, Lyra looked at Ethan with shining pride, her voice soft as she spoke his name again. Saris, breathing heavily, walked closer, her towering shadow covering him. For a moment, Ethan braced for her scorn, but instead, she lowered her head in a firm nod, her voice rough but steady. It was not affection, not yet, but it was acceptance. For the first time, Saris had acknowledged him not just as a survivor, but as one of them. Ethan felt the weight of that moment settle in his chest. He was no longer just a human trapped by fate. He was part of their circle now, bound by fire, by blood, and by survival. The three of them, human and giantesses, were no longer enemies, no longer strangers. They were allies, perhaps even something deeper. And as the stars above shifted slowly across the sky, Ethan could not help but wonder if this alliance was destiny, or the first step towards something far greater. The alliance between Ethan, Lyra, and Saris had grown strong. Days turned into weeks, and the forest that once felt like a prison now felt like a battlefield they commanded together. They hunted, they fought, they survived. Ethan had gone from prey to partner, from weakness to weapon. And though Saris's eyes still held fire, that fire no longer burned against him. It burned for him, beside him. Lyra, gentle as ever, now spoke his name with warmth, her melodic voice turning into something close to affection. But fate, as always, waited with its cruel hand. One night, as the stars shimmered above and the fire cracked gently between them, a sound split the silence. Not the cry of a beast, not the groan of the forest, but something far worse. The roar of engines, deep and metallic, echoing across the sky. Ethan's heart froze as he looked up. Through the clouds, enormous shapes descended, their lights cutting across the night like blades. Ships, vast and terrifying, marked with glowing symbols that pulsed like blood. Lyra and Saris stood instantly, their faces pale, their bodies tense. They knew these ships, Ethan realized. They were not strangers, they were their own kind. The exile was over, their people had found them. The ground shook as one of the vessels landed nearby, trees snapping like twigs under its weight. From the ramp spilled figures, giantesses clad in armor, their eyes sharp, their voices cold. They moved with military precision, weapons glowing with deadly light. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs as he realized the truth. These were not rescuers, they were hunters, and to them, He was nothing but prey. The leader, a towering figure with silver hair and burning eyes, spoke with authority. Her voice rolled like thunder, her words striking Lyra and Ceres like whips. Ethan could not understand the language, but he saw Lyra's shoulders sag, her eyes filling with sorrow. Ceres snarled back, her tone sharp, defiant. She stepped in front of Ethan, her body tense like a shield. The leader's gaze shifted toward the human, and a cruel smile touched her lips. To her, he was nothing but proof of weakness, a creature unworthy of protection. Ethan's mind raced. This was the end. He had fought beasts, survived trials, earned trust, but none of it mattered before these armored giants. They would take him, kill him, and punish the sisters for daring to protect him. But Ceres did not step aside. For the first time, the fierce warrior who once despised him stood between him and certain death. Her voice was a roar, filled with rage and pride. Lyra joined her, her melodic tone sharp with defiance. Together they stood, two exiles refusing to bow. The armored giants raised their weapons, light crackling across the clearing. Ethan knew the sisters could not win, not against so many, but his heart blazed with the same fire that had carried him through every trial. He would not be prey, not now, not ever. He grabbed the broken metal spear he had reforged, his hands tight, his breath steady. His voice cut the silence, trembling but strong. Human, he shouted, pointing to himself, then to Lyra and Ceres. Not prey, not enemy, ally. The words were simple, but his voice carried power. Lyra's eyes shone with tears. Ceres's lips curled into a fierce grin. For the first time, all three stood together not as captor and captive, but as one. The leader hesitated, her cruel smile fading for a moment as she studied the small figure who refused to kneel. Around them, the armored soldiers shifted, uncertain. Ethan's defiance, Ceres's roar, Lyra's steady gaze. It was a spark small, but dangerous. A spark that could ignite rebellion. The standoff hung in the air, the night holding its breath. Ethan did not know if they would survive, if the sisters' people would kill him or drag them all away. But in that moment, one truth was clear. He was no longer trapped by fate. He was bound to it, shaping it with his choices. And whatever came next, death, battle, or something far greater, he would not face it alone. He had come to this world a prisoner, but now he stood as part of a family, a bond born of fire, fear, and courage. Fate had other plans still, and Ethan was ready to face them.